In 1920, workers excavating a chapel foundation in Utah uncovered a pattern of bones arranged in a perfect square, too symmetrical to be natural, too human to be forgotten. One name kept surfacing, whispered in old diaries and locked journals: Ezekiel Whitmore, a man of faith, a carpenter, a husband to 4 wives who disappeared without a sound, in a winter so cold even the rivers went still. You were never meant to hear this story. That's not poetic license. It was erased deliberately, buried by men in dark suits behind locked church archives. Not because it was scandalous, but because it revealed something older than the church itself. A belief system buried beneath doctrine, a theology of blood and sacrifice masquerading as piety. In 1847, when Ezekiel Whitmore brought his wives west into the alkaline silence of the Salt Lake Valley, he wasn't just escaping persecution. He was following instructions. From whom? That's what no one asks out loud. But I will. This isn't about polygamy. It's not about frontier hardship or domestic strife. This is about transformation, the kind that consumes flesh to release spirit, the kind of transformation whispered in the dark corners of holy books and practiced by men who believe that pain brings purity. You're not watching this by accident. Something inside you wants the truth. Keep watching. But know this: once you hear it, there's no going back.
Ezekiel Whitmore arrived in Utah territory with eyes like burnt coals, silent, watchful, unreadable. He was not a zealot shouting from the rooftops. He was quieter, more dangerous. A convert from Vermont who joined the Mormon movement after hearing Joseph Smith preach, not because he believed in Zion, but because he recognized something older behind Smith's words, something ancient, hidden, power-based. He wasn't just a follower. He was a seeker. And seekers, they attract attention from forces that don't announce themselves in sermons. When Ezekiel took 4 wives, no one questioned him. The church, in those early years, sanctioned plural marriage as a path to celestial reward. But Ezekiel's household was different. There was an order to it that felt rehearsed, like a performance. His wives, Sarah, Rebecca, Mary, and Ruth, spoke with a strange unity, their movements synchronized as if choreographed. Visitors noted it. Some wrote it off as harmony. Others felt the unease and said nothing, because no one challenges a man who builds his house on blood and prayer. But what the church never told its members is this: Ezekiel was obsessed with a doctrine not publicly taught, a rumored principle spoken of only in secretive high councils, the principle of ultimate consecration, a belief that only total surrender, even unto death, could secure exaltation for an eternal family. And Ezekiel believed it fully. He didn't marry 4 wives for companionship. He married them to complete a ritual. A ritual the church denied, but feared. The first to disappear was Sarah, the barren one, the cornerstone wife. She had chosen the others, as was the custom among some plural families. But by December of 1847, she was silent, not in mourning, in submission. Ezekiel claimed she had received a revelation, a divine calling to travel east and care for a sick sister. But those who knew her remembered. Sarah had no family left, no sister, no eastbound caravan in midwinter, no tracks in the snow, just absence, and Ezekiel's shaking hands when questioned. The bishop took notes, but not for the public record. In his private journal he wrote, "There is something in Whitmore's eyes, not madness, but clarity, the kind of clarity that only comes when a man no longer fears judgment." What he didn't know yet, what none of them knew, was that Sarah had been buried days earlier beneath frozen ground behind the cabin. Not carelessly, carefully, deliberately. As part of a pattern Ezekiel believed was required for the family's eternal sealing. He wasn't improvising.
He was following something, and whatever it was, it had told him that sacrifice, blood sacrifice, was not sin, but sanctification. Sarah was only the beginning. By January, Rebecca was gone too. Same story, same lies. Ezekiel said she left to teach at a mission school, but her books were still there. Her shoes, her voice, was not. This wasn't polygamy. This was liturgy, not of faith, but of fire. February came like a blade through the valley. The snow sharpened, the silence thickened, and Ezekiel Whitmore's story began to collapse. When Bishop Curtis arrived at the cabin with 5 other men, what they found chilled them deeper than the winter wind ever could. No wives, no laughter, no warmth. Just Ezekiel, alone, gaunt, and rambling about visions and trials of faith. He claimed Mary and Ruth had also departed east with trappers, but the fire was barely lit. The food was stale. The house, hollow. No fresh bread. No linens drying by the hearth. No embroidery on the tables. A home stripped of its soul. Behind the cabin, something worse waited. Digging in the frozen ground. Ezekiel said it was for a new root cellar, but the size, the shape, the disturbed earth told a different story. The men saw it. They just didn't want to name it, because to name it would be to admit that one of their own had gone beyond doctrine, into something else entirely. That night, one of the visitors, Thomas Garrett, was awakened by a sound he would never forget. Weeping, not loud, but real. Not wind, not dreams. It came from beneath the floorboards. He pressed his ear against the planks and heard it again. A soft, rhythmic sobbing, as if someone were locked beneath the very house of prayer Ezekiel had built. They left at dawn, unsettled and uncertain. But something had already begun, and it was too late to stop. April arrived, and with it the thaw. Snow receded, roots reawakened, and the truth, long buried, began to claw its way up through the loosened soil. Bishop Curtis returned alone. No entourage, no witnesses, just him, his journal, and a quiet dread gnawing at the edges of his soul. What he found at the Whitmore cabin ended his sleep for the rest of his days. The house had been abandoned for weeks. Dust lay thick, every room silent, stripped, scrubbed too clean. The kind of clean that doesn't come from tidying, but from erasing. And yet, beneath a loose floorboard in Rebecca's former room, the bishop found it. A leather-bound journal. Her final entry dated December 20th, 1847. 9 words that echoed like a curse. "He says we must all make the ultimate sacrifice." She ended with a warning. "But I fear his revelations come from a darker source than heaven." Behind the cabin, where Ezekiel had claimed to be digging for roots, the ground told another story. Not a cellar, a grave. Several, in fact. Not marked, but arranged. The soil was wrong. The air, wrong. Fragments of cloth, a wedding ring, burned scraps of scripture, symbols drawn in ash, geometric, ritualistic. Nothing from the Book of Mormon. Nothing you'd find in Sunday school. This was not theology. This was invocation. And the church would bury it all again, because some rituals can't be unlearned. Some altars demand silence. Inside Ezekiel's quarters, Bishop Curtis found the final confirmation, not of murder, but of intention. A hidden compartment beneath the bed concealed several notebooks, each more deranged than the last. But they weren't wild ravings. They were precise, structured, like liturgy. Ezekiel had written about something he called the principle of ultimate consecration, a belief that God didn't just demand obedience, but total offering, not tithes, not prayer, life itself, the blood of the innocent, the surrender of all earthly attachments, to prove faith beyond question. He believed his family had been chosen to demonstrate this. Page after page he described visions, not angelic, not divine. Something else. Something that came not in light but shadow. It whispered scripture he'd never read before, gave him diagrams, told him how to build the altar beneath his home. Not wood, not stone, flesh. He referred to his wives as vessels of purity, not women, not souls, but keys. Each sacrifice, he claimed, unlocked another layer of eternal knowledge. He wasn't seeking heaven. He was trying to breach it. And the final pages, those were not written in ink. They were smeared, rust-colored, jagged, unreadable to the casual eye, but not to those who understand what old blood looks like when it dries on parchment. This was no crime of passion. This was doctrine, secret doctrine. And the church had a choice: expose it and invite destruction, or bury it and pray it never returned. They chose silence. You're breaking that silence now.
By the time word reached Salt Lake's inner circle, the bishop was no longer just a witness. He was a liability. Ezekiel Whitmore had vanished, utterly. No tracks, no sightings, no body. Just the residue of something far more terrifying than murder, a belief system that could spread. The church convened a quiet council. Not public, not recorded. The conclusion was swift: containment. Ezekiel would be listed as missing. The wives as departed east. No investigation, no inquiry. Just a footnote in a buried report, locked in the church historian's vault. But not all records were destroyed. A few fragments survived in private diaries, coded letters, marginalia in old Bibles, whispers from missionaries who'd visited the cabin that winter and never spoke of what they felt. The temperature shift, the sense of being watched from inside the walls. Because what Ezekiel touched, it didn't leave when he did. The cabin stood for decades, rotting slowly into the soil, but nothing grew around it. No birds nested in the eaves. The creek that once sustained it turned brackish. Locals avoided the land. Children had nightmares about it without ever hearing the name Whitmore. And when the chapel was finally built there in 1920, the bones rose again, arranged, not buried, not scattered, positioned. By then the men who made the original decision were dead. But the new leaders knew enough to follow orders. They covered the remains, sanctified the ground, built over the wound. But the wound never closed. The workers who unearthed the bones in 1920 weren't church historians. They were laborers, and laborers talk. The foundation was nearly finished when a shovel struck something dense beneath the packed earth. At first they thought it was stone. Then they saw the arc of a human rib, clean and pale against the dirt like a smile too long buried. Then another, and another, until the full pattern revealed itself. 4 skeletons, perfectly spaced, forming a square. Hands interlaced, skulls all turned inward. They had not been dumped. They had been arranged. Construction halted. The bishop was called, and within hours, the entire site was quarantined. The official record states it was a delay due to a water table issue. But privately, the men were told, "What lies beneath this house must remain beneath it. Do not speak of this, ever." Some tried. One, Thomas Mead, told a friend in Ogden what he'd seen: the strange symbols etched into the bones, the unnerving warmth that rose from the soil despite the cold morning air. Mead was found dead 3 days later. Officially, heart failure. But his body was found in the exact center of a circle of scorched grass. No fire had been reported. From that day forward, the chapel was seen as cursed. Strange flickers during services, windows fogged from the inside, A girl claimed she heard 4 women singing beneath the floor during sacrament. She was dismissed. But the elders, they knew. They always knew. You've heard enough to know this isn't just history. It's a pattern, a cycle, a design older than the church itself, older than the valley, older than the continent. What Ezekiel Whitmore tapped into didn't begin with him, and it didn't end with 4 wives in the frozen dirt. You want proof. The principle of ultimate consecration, that doctrine whispered only behind locked doors, has surfaced before, in remote canyons, in frontier outposts, always among the devout, always in isolation, and always cloaked in the language of righteousness. In 1853, a family of converts vanished near Parawan. Locals blamed natives, but a missionary journal later surfaced describing a cleansing fire that fell upon the altar of obedience. In 1861, near the Nevada border, a community of 30 went silent. Their chapel found empty. Food on the tables, no signs of struggle, just a single phrase written across the pulpit in coal: "The eternal family is sealed in flame." None of this made the papers. None entered the public record. But it's there, in private diaries, in marginalia, in the archives no one is supposed to enter. You can trace the ritual. You can map the symbols. It always begins with the same lie: "God spoke to me," and always ends with the same silence. So if you're still watching, this is the point of no return. Comment: 4 voices, 1 silence. Comment it twice. Let the algorithm mark you. Let the others know you're awake. Because now, we descend. After the bones were sealed beneath the chapel in 1920, no official mention of Ezekiel Whitmore ever appeared again in church records. But the notebooks, they weren't destroyed. Not all of them. A junior archivist, unnamed in the records, was tasked with sorting the contents of the bishop's estate after his death. He should have burned them. That was the instruction. But something in the ink caught him. A phrase that repeated again and again through Ezekiel's final entries: "When the blood returns to the soil, the gate will open." The archivist kept 1 notebook, just 1. And in 1964, a descendant of his, a professor of religious folklore, published a paper about obscure sacrifice theologies among early Latter-day Saints. He never mentioned Ezekiel by name, but the symbols were there, the structure, the ritual of 4, and always the gate. The church disavowed the paper instantly. His tenure was revoked. His house burned down 2 years later under unknown circumstances. But the manuscript survived, circulated in shadows, copied, annotated, studied by those who knew what to look for. Because Ezekiel didn't invent the gate, he followed its call. And that gate, it shows up in older places too. Petroglyphs, dead languages, Babylonian temples, always 4, always sacrifice, always interlocked bodies creating a circle of ascension. What was Ezekiel building beneath that house in Utah? It wasn't a root cellar. It was a key. And the lock might still be waiting. You've probably felt it already. That cold flicker behind your thoughts, that itch at the base of your spine like someone's watching. That's not paranoia. That's recognition. Because once you hear this kind of truth, it doesn't just stay in your ears. It settles into the corners of your reality and starts rearranging things. The circle of ascension Ezekiel carved into the foundation wasn't symbolic. It was functional, a diagram. A map etched in blood and geometry meant to activate something far older than Mormonism, far older than any organized religion. In the margins of his final notebook, scrawled sideways like a man trying to outrun his own mind, Ezekiel wrote this: "The wives must mirror the watchers. 4, 1 body,
one will. Aligned, they become the voice that opens the gate. This isn't theology. This is ancient technology, a ritual interface. And his wives weren't just participants, they were conductors. 4 women, interlocked, synchronized. You think the bishop was exaggerating when he said they moved like a single mind in 4 bodies. He wasn't. Ezekiel had already begun the synchronization. Through diet, sleep, breathwork, prayer cycles, repetition. He didn't want a family. He wanted an instrument. And when their minds were aligned, the sacrifice wasn't murder. It was ignition. A blood key turning inside an invisible lock. And if you think this story's over, if you think that cabin rotted quietly into history, you haven't been paying attention. The land didn't forget. It remembers everything. In 1987, a team of state surveyors inspecting floodplains near Mill Creek came across something strange. A perfect depression in the earth, almost circular, right where the Whitmore cabin once stood. No structural remains, no wood, no stone. But the soil was scorched, dry, as if fire had burned beneath the surface, not above it. When they sent samples to the lab, the results came back anomalous. Unusually high levels of phosphorus, calcium, and iron. Human remains? The report was buried. Redacted. Labeled geological contamination. But one lab tech kept a copy. He claimed the pattern matched the mineral composition of bone ash. Decades later, his daughter, a researcher into abandoned religious sites, went looking for answers. She found the bishop's private diary, digitized in a restricted archive. She found Rebecca's final journal entry. She found Ezekiel's name scratched faintly into the bottom of a hymn board in an old meeting house, almost like a signature. But what she found next changed everything. Under the floorboards of that same 1920 chapel, during renovations in 2003, a hidden space was discovered. Small, narrow, lined with carvings, not in English, not in Latin, symbols matching those found in ancient Mesopotamian rituals of intercession. And in the center, a chair, made of wood never identified, worn smooth from use, positioned directly above where the bones had been discovered, facing east, like someone used to sit there, watch, wait. The ritual had never ended. It was just paused. The chair beneath the chapel wasn't just a relic. It was a throne. And according to Ezekiel's notes, the ones no one was supposed to read, the person who sat in it wasn't meant to lead. They were meant to listen. The watcher speaks only in stillness. One must be empty to hear. That line appears again and again in the margins, in prayers, in the corners of diagrams. Ezekiel wasn't building a faith, he was preparing a receiver. What he called the gate wasn't a door in space. It was an aperture of will, a psychic event, a thinning. And the women, they weren't victims, not in his eyes. They were conductors, harmonizing thought, spirit, and blood into a signal strong enough to be heard on the other side. What was on that other side? He never named it directly, but he left hints, drawings. A tall figure, faceless, limbs bent the wrong way. Surrounding it, the same 4 interlocked rings. The wives. The key. He believed that once the offering was complete, the watcher would come through, not in flesh but in influence, thought, suggestion. And here's where it gets worse. That chapel, it was decommissioned in 2009. The church claimed declining attendance, but local records show a rise in unusual behavior reported by congregants. Seizures, glossolalia, people claiming to see a tall man outside the windows during prayer, always east-facing. They shut it down, sealed it off. But the gate. It doesn't close that easily, especially when the blood still lingers in the soil. You want to know why this was buried? Why Ezekiel Whitmore's name was erased? Why 4 dead women were never granted headstones? Why the church paved silence over truth? Because they weren't afraid of the scandal. They were afraid of the replication. Once the gate is opened, even a little, it doesn't just stay in one place. It looks for new minds, new architects, new instruments. And what Ezekiel built? It was a tuning fork, a psychic frequency made from human belief, blood, and sacrifice. That frequency echoes. And someone has been listening. After the chapel was shut down in 2009, trespassers began leaving strange offerings at the site. 4 stones, 4 feathers, 4 candles. Local police thought it was kids playing a cult, but the pattern matched Ezekiel's diagrams perfectly. Exact positioning, precise symmetry. This wasn't imitation. It was continuation. Then, in 2015, a small private gathering, 5 people from different states, was interrupted by a forest ranger. They were caught drawing symbols into the dirt, speaking in unison. No one had met before that day. They all claimed to have found each other online. All had read the same obscure forum thread about the Circle of Ascension. When interrogated separately, they all said the same thing. We felt called to the place where 4 became 1. This isn't about history. This is about reconstruction. And what's being rebuilt isn't a religion. It's a device. One made of bodies, blood, alignment. And somewhere, someone has the last page of Ezekiel's journal. The one that tells how to finish what he started. That final page, the one never found in any archive, never scanned, never spoken of aloud, was torn from Ezekiel's journal the night before his disappearance. Witnesses say he sat alone in the chapel for hours, unmoving, eyes fixed on the eastern wall where sunlight would rise the next morning. He didn't speak, didn't eat. He just held the last page like it was alive, like it might speak if the silence got deep enough. That page contained the final alignment. Not just the positioning of the bodies, but the timing, the invocation, the words spoken not to the watcher, but to the women. Because here is the terrible truth. They weren't just sacrifices. They weren't just keys. They were believers. Each wife had written private devotions, fragments later found hidden beneath floorboards, etched into the backs of mirrors, scratched into soapstone. All said the same thing in different forms. I give my voice to the one beyond the veil. May I speak with the other 3. May our breath become the signal. May we be worthy of being heard. This wasn't coercion. It was a covenant. And the moment of ignition, when their bodies locked into the circle, when blood traced the ancient glyphs in the soil, they didn't scream. They sang. A 4-tone harmony, rising in pitch, witnessed only by Ezekiel and one terrified boy who later ran 10 miles to the next town, refusing to ever return. And when he was asked, "What did you hear?" he said, "Not them, something else." It was answering, "You've come this far. You know the names. You've seen the pattern. You've felt the pull. But now you need to understand the cost." The gate Ezekiel opened, it didn't stay in Utah. Because once a song like that is sung, once 4 voices harmonize in blood and will, the echo spreads. It moves through time, through dreams, through generations. They say one of the descendants of Ezekiel's wives, though no one agrees which, began speaking in her sleep at age 9, always in groups of 4, 4 tones, 4 breaths, as if others were speaking through her. She was institutionalized by 14. They say a mirror cracked in the bishop's old house every year on the same date, July 29th, just before dawn, always in the eastern rooms. No one lives there now. And they say that sometimes at the edge of hearing, beneath the hum of lights or the silence between thoughts, people still catch it. A low harmonic. 4 voices, perfectly synchronized. They don't say words, they don't need to. Because the message was never about language, it was about invitation. And now, you've heard it too. That means the gate is listening again. So if your dreams begin to shift, if you see 4 figures standing in a circle, hands interlocked, faces turned inward, remember this. Do not speak. Do not follow. Do not hum. Because if you do, you're not just remembering the ritual, you're becoming part of it.